There are moments in war where the outcome is decided long before the first soldier moves, and the men who step into that moment do not know they are walking into something that has already been shaped against them. This story begins not on a battlefield, not under fire, and not in chaos, but in a quiet, controlled environment where nothing appears urgent and nothing feels dangerous. An officer sits at a desk, reviewing documents that look ordinary at first glance: movement schedules, unit positions, supply routes, and expected enemy behavior. Everything is structured, everything is organized, everything suggests control and certainty. The kind of certainty that allows commanders to believe that the situation is understood and that the plan they are about to execute will unfold in a predictable way. The operation itself has been prepared carefully. Units have been assigned objectives. Routes have been selected based on terrain and intelligence. Communication systems have been tested and confirmed. Every detail has been reviewed and approved multiple times. There is no visible reason to doubt the outcome, because nothing in the preparation indicates weakness. The soldiers who will carry out this mission are trained, disciplined, and experienced. They trust the system because the system has worked before, and in war, past success often creates a belief that the same methods will continue to produce the same results. What none of them can see at this point is that the system they are relying on is no longer intact. It has not collapsed, it has not failed in an obvious way, but it has been quietly altered in a way that changes everything without revealing itself immediately. This kind of change does not create alarms. It does not trigger immediate reactions. It exists beneath the surface, hidden inside information that appears correct, but is no longer reliable. Days earlier, a small event occurred that did not seem significant at the time. A transfer of materials, a movement of information, a process that happens regularly in the background of military operations. It did not involve large forces or visible conflict. It did not attract attention, and because of that, it was not treated as a threat. But inside that moment, something critical shifted. Information that should have remained protected was exposed, not completely, not in a way that revealed everything instantly, but enough to begin forming a picture. At first, the pieces meant very little on their own. A location here, a timing detail there, fragments that without context do not appear dangerous. But war is not always about having full information. It is about having enough information to reduce uncertainty, and once uncertainty begins to disappear, the balance starts to change. The side that understands even slightly more gains an advantage that grows with every additional piece. As time passes, more signals are observed, movements are tracked, patterns begin to emerge. What was once a collection of fragments becomes a structure, a framework that reveals not just what is happening, but what is likely to happen next. This is where the shift becomes irreversible, because once a plan is understood, it can be anticipated, and once it can be anticipated, it can be shaped without the other side realizing it. Back at the command level, nothing appears wrong. Reports continue to confirm readiness. Units report in position. Communications remain active. The structure of the operation is intact, and from every visible angle, it looks correct. There is no clear reason to delay. There is no obvious threat that would justify stopping or changing the plan, and so the decision is made to proceed. The soldiers begin to move under conditions that feel controlled and organized. Their objectives are clear, their routes are defined, and their expectations are based on the belief that the situation ahead of them is uncertain but manageable. They are prepared for resistance. They are prepared for unexpected challenges, but they are not prepared for the possibility that the environment itself has already been arranged to meet them. As they advance, the first phase unfolds exactly as expected, which reinforces confidence. Early reports suggest progress. Positions are reached without major resistance. Communication remains stable, and the operation appears to be moving in the right direction. This is the most dangerous moment because success at the beginning creates the illusion that the plan is working exactly as intended. But beneath that surface, something is already changing. The deeper the units move, the more precise the opposition becomes. Resistance begins to appear, not randomly, but in specific locations that align too closely with their movements. Positions that should have been clear are occupied. Pathways that were expected to be open are blocked. The timing of these encounters is too exact to be coincidence, but not yet obvious enough to trigger full concern. The soldiers adapt, as they are trained to do. They adjust their movements, they modify their approach, they respond to the conditions in front of them. But every adjustment leads them further into positions where the same pattern repeats. The resistance does not disappear, it follows them. It meets them at each step, as if their path is being tracked in real time. At this stage, the command structure still interprets these events as part of the natural uncertainty of combat, because in war, nothing is ever perfectly predictable. And unexpected resistance is always possible. The difference here is subtle, but critical, because this is not random resistance, it is informed resistance, and the distinction between the two is not immediately visible from the ground level. As pressure begins to build, the rhythm of the operation starts to shift. Movements slow slightly, not enough to cause alarm, but enough to create tension. Decisions take a fraction longer. Communication becomes more deliberate, and the sense of control that existed at the start begins to weaken. The soldiers are still moving forward, but the confidence that carried them into the operation is no longer as strong as it was. This is the point where awareness begins to change, not as a clear realization, but as a feeling that something is not aligning with expectation. It is difficult to define, it is difficult to explain, but it exists in the background, influencing decisions in ways that are not fully conscious. The environment feels different. The responses feel too accurate. The timing feels too precise. And still they continue, because stopping is not an option, and retreat is not yet justified. The plan is still active, the objective is still ahead, and from a structural perspective, the operation has not officially failed. But the conditions under which it is being executed have already been altered in a way that cannot be reversed. What makes this situation so dangerous is that the soldiers are no longer operating within their own framework. They believe they are following a plan that they understand, but in reality, they are moving through a space that has been prepared for them by an opponent who has already seen the outline of their actions. This creates a form of control that does not rely on direct force. It relies on positioning, on timing, on anticipation. The enemy does not need to react quickly because they are already in place. They do not need to guess because the guess has already been removed. And this is the moment where the outcome begins to take shape, not through a single decisive event, but through a series of small, controlled interactions that gradually limit the options available to those moving forward. Each step reduces flexibility. Each decision becomes more constrained. Each movement leads closer to a point where the ability to adapt is no longer enough to change the direction of what is happening. From the outside, This still looks like an active operation, with progress being made and resistance being managed. But from within the structure, the reality is different. The space for error is shrinking. The margin for recovery is disappearing, and the system that was designed to create success is now operating inside conditions that prevent it. The soldiers cannot see the full picture because no individual perspective can capture it entirely. They experience only the immediate environment, the immediate threat, the immediate decision, but the larger pattern is forming above and around them, connecting each moment into a sequence that leads toward a result that has already been influenced before they ever arrived. This is why the most important part of this story is not what happens next. It is what has already happened. It is the shift that took place quietly, without recognition. It is the moment when information changed hands, and with it, the balance of understanding changed as well. Because once one side knows what the other side intends to do, the nature of the conflict changes completely. It is no longer a contest of reaction, it becomes a process of execution, where one side is following a script they believe is their own, and the other side is reading it in advance. And by the time the first real signs of failure become visible, the outcome is no longer being decided. It is being revealed. By the time the operation had moved beyond its initial phase, the changes that had begun beneath the surface were no longer subtle. Yet they were still not fully understood, and that is what made them so dangerous. Because when a problem cannot be clearly identified, it cannot be properly addressed. And when it cannot be addressed, it continues to grow without resistance. The soldiers advancing through this environment were still following their orders, still moving toward their objectives, still believing that what they were experiencing was within the range of normal combat conditions. But the pattern was becoming harder to ignore with each passing moment. The resistance they encountered was no longer scattered or unpredictable. It was structured. It appeared at specific points, in a way that suggested awareness, not just of their presence, but of their direction and timing. Positions that should have been neutral were occupied in advance. Movements that should have been concealed were met with immediate response, and the deeper they moved, the more consistent this pattern became. It was not overwhelming force that defined the opposition. It was precision. And precision in war often reveals something that force alone does not reveal, which is knowledge. At the command level, the situation was still being interpreted through familiar frameworks. Reports were analyzed, adjustments were made, and explanations were formed based on the assumption that the environment remained fundamentally uncertain. The idea that the enemy might possess detailed insight into the operation itself was not immediately accepted, because such a possibility challenges the foundation of the entire plan, and accepting it requires a shift that is difficult to make in real time. But the signs continued to accumulate. Communication delays began to appear in ways that could not be easily explained. Units that should have been able to coordinate effectively found themselves out of sync, not because of technical failure, but because the timing of events around them no longer matched their expectations. Orders that were based on previous conditions became less effective as those conditions changed faster than the system could adapt. This is where the internal pressure begins to match the external one. Because as the environment becomes less predictable, the cognitive load on each individual increases. The soldiers are no longer just executing tasks. They are interpreting a situation that does not align with their training, and that requires additional processing, which slows decision-making even further. The command structure is doing the same at a higher level, attempting to reconcile incoming information with a model that is becoming less accurate with each update. And still, there is no single moment where everything becomes clear. Instead, there is a gradual shift from confidence to uncertainty, from certainty to doubt, from control to reaction. The operation does not collapse suddenly. It begins to lose coherence piece by piece, and as that coherence fades, the ability to maintain momentum fades with it. At this point, the enemy does not need to increase their level of engagement, because the structure they are working within is already producing the desired effect. They are not creating chaos. They are allowing the existing plan to lead itself into positions where it cannot function effectively. This is a form of control that is difficult to detect, because it does not appear as direct interference. It appears as a series of natural outcomes that are slightly misaligned with expectation. For the soldiers on the ground, this misalignment becomes a constant presence. It is felt in the timing of engagements, in the positioning of opposition, in the way each movement seems to lead into another obstacle. The sense of progression that existed at the beginning is replaced by a sense of repetition, where each attempt to advance results in a similar outcome, and each adjustment leads to a similar response. This repetition is not random. It is the result of operating within a framework that has already been anticipated and shaped. The soldiers are still making decisions, but the range of effective decisions is narrowing, and as that range narrows, the difference between choice and inevitability becomes smaller. From a psychological perspective, this creates a unique form of stress, because it is not driven solely by immediate danger, but by the growing realization that the situation is not responding as expected. The mind attempts to reconcile this difference by searching for explanations, by adjusting assumptions, by trying to regain a sense of control. But when those efforts do not produce results, the effect is cumulative. Focus begins to fragment. Attention shifts between multiple competing inputs, none of which provide a clear path forward. The ability to prioritize becomes more difficult, and when prioritization fails, the efficiency of action declines, even if the willingness to act remains strong. This is not a failure of effort. It is a limitation of processing under conditions that exceed normal thresholds. At the same time, the command structure is facing a parallel challenge at a larger scale. Decisions that would normally be straightforward become complex because they are based on information that no longer reflects the reality on the ground. The time required to evaluate options increases, while the time available to act decreases. And this imbalance creates a delay that compounds with each iteration. The result is a system that continues to move, but with decreasing alignment between intention and outcome. Orders are issued based on one set of assumptions, actions are taken within another set of conditions, and the connection between the two becomes weaker over time. This does not stop the operation, but it changes its nature from controlled execution to reactive movement. And yet, even at this stage, the full truth has not been accepted, because accepting it would require acknowledging that the foundation of the operation has been compromised in a way that cannot be corrected through normal adjustments. It would require recognizing that the issue is not within the execution, but within the information that guided the execution from the beginning. This recognition does not happen all at once. It begins as a possibility, then becomes a concern, and only later becomes a conclusion. By the time it reaches that point, the system is already operating within constraints that cannot be easily removed. The soldiers continue to move forward, because forward is the only direction that remains viable. The command continues to issue orders, because the absence of orders would create even greater instability. The operation continues because stopping it would require a level of certainty that does not yet exist. But beneath all of this, there is a growing awareness that the situation is not unfolding as intended, and that awareness changes the way every subsequent moment is experienced. It changes the interpretation of events. It changes the confidence in decisions. It changes the perception of control. And once that perception shifts, the operation is no longer defined solely by what is happening on the ground. It is defined by the gap between expectation and reality, a gap that continues to widen with every step forward. By the time the operation reached its most critical phase, the pattern that had been forming beneath the surface was no longer something that could be ignored or explained away through standard assumptions, because the consistency of the resistance, the precision of the response, and the timing of every engagement had aligned in a way that removed any remaining doubt that what they were facing was not simply an unpredictable battlefield, but an environment that had already been shaped against them. And this realization did not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of moments that no longer fit within the framework they had been given. Units moving through separate sectors began reporting similar experiences, despite operating under different conditions and different command structures, which suggested that the issue was not localized, but systemic. Positions that were expected to be clear were not just occupied, they were prepared. Movements that should have gone unnoticed were intercepted before they could be completed, and attempts to change direction were met with responses that indicated those changes had already been anticipated. The effect of this was not immediate collapse, but a slow tightening of constraints, where each option that remained available became less effective than the last. At the level of individual soldiers, the impact of this shift became increasingly difficult to manage, because the environment no longer behaved in a way that could be understood through experience or training. And when the brain cannot map current conditions onto known patterns, it must create new ones in real time, and that process requires time and cognitive resources that are already limited under stress. The result is a delay, not in intention, but in execution, where the decision to act exists, but the pathway to act is unclear. This delay appears in small ways at first. A pause before movement, a hesitation before engagement, a moment where the expected sequence of actions does not occur as smoothly as it should. These moments are brief, but they accumulate, and as they accumulate, they begin to alter the overall tempo of the operation. The rhythm that once carried the units forward begins to break, and once that rhythm is lost, the effort required to maintain momentum increases significantly. Commanders observing these changes face a challenge that is both tactical and psychological, because the information they are receiving does not align with the expectations they formed during planning. And when information conflicts with expectation, the natural response is to attempt to reconcile the two, rather than immediately discard one in favor of the other. This leads to adjustments that are based on the assumption that the core plan is still valid, when in reality, the validity of the plan itself is what is being challenged. As these adjustments are implemented, they fail to produce the intended results, not because they are poorly designed, but because they are being applied within a framework that no longer matches the conditions on the ground. And this creates a feedback loop, where each unsuccessful adjustment leads to further analysis, further modification, and further delay, while the situation continues to evolve in a direction that is already being guided by the opposing force. At a certain point, the accumulation of these factors reaches a threshold where the difference between expectation and reality can no longer be bridged through incremental change, and this is the moment where recognition begins to take form, not as a fully defined conclusion, but as a shift in perception, where the possibility that the entire operation has been compromised becomes impossible to ignore. This shift does not immediately provide clarity, but it changes the way every subsequent piece of information is interpreted. What was once seen as isolated resistance is now viewed as coordinated. What was once considered unexpected is now considered intentional. What was once treated as manageable becomes recognized as part of a larger structure that is influencing the outcome at every level. This change in perception is critical because it alters the decision-making process from one based on execution to one based on survival within a system that is no longer under their control. For the soldiers on the ground, this realization manifests not as a clear understanding of the situation, but as a change in behavior. Movement becomes more cautious, not out of fear, but out of recognition that previous patterns no longer apply. Engagements become more deliberate, not because time is available, but because the cost of acting without understanding has increased. The environment is no longer something to move through. It is something that must be constantly interpreted. This constant interpretation places additional strain on cognitive resources that are already under pressure, and as those resources are taxed further, the efficiency of both individual and collective action begins to decline. The soldiers are still capable, still willing, still trained, but the conditions under which they are operating reduce the effectiveness of those capabilities in ways that cannot be easily compensated for. At the command level, the realization that the operation may have been compromised introduces a new dimension of uncertainty, because it raises questions that cannot be answered quickly or definitively. How much of the plan is known? Which elements have been exposed? What actions can be taken to mitigate the damage without creating additional risk? These questions require analysis, and analysis requires time, but time is the one resource that is no longer available in sufficient quantity. The decision to continue the operation despite this uncertainty is not made lightly, but it is made because the alternatives carry their own risks, and in a situation where no option is clearly safe, the path that maintains some degree of forward movement is often chosen over the one that introduces immediate disruption. This decision does not resolve the underlying issue, but it allows the operation to proceed under conditions that are now fully understood to be unfavorable. As the situation progresses, the consequences of this imbalance become more visible. Units that have advanced beyond certain points find themselves increasingly isolated, not because of physical distance, but because the coordination that once connected them to the larger structure has weakened. Communication becomes less reliable, not in terms of signal, but in terms of relevance, because the information being exchanged no longer reflects the reality that each unit is experiencing. This isolation amplifies the effects of the compromised environment, because each unit must rely more heavily on its own interpretation of events, and when those interpretations are based on incomplete or outdated information, the likelihood of misalignment increases further. The operation continues, but it does so with a level of fragmentation that reduces its overall coherence and effectiveness. At this stage, the outcome is not yet fully visible, but the direction is becoming clear. The combination of compromised information, precise opposition, and increasing internal strain has created conditions where the original objectives are no longer achievable within the parameters that were established at the beginning. The operation is still active, but it is no longer functioning as intended. And this is the point where the true nature of the situation becomes undeniable, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a cumulative understanding that the factors determining the outcome were set in motion before the operation began, and that the events unfolding now are the result of those earlier conditions being revealed through action. The soldiers continue to move, the command continues to direct, the system continues to operate, but the result that is emerging is no longer being shaped by the decisions being made in the present. It is being shaped by the knowledge that was acquired in the past and the way that knowledge has been used to structure the environment in which those decisions are being executed. And once that structure is in place, the range of possible outcomes narrows rapidly until only one remains viable, not because it was chosen in the moment, but because it was made possible long before the moment arrived. By the time the operation reached its conclusion, the visible outcome could be recorded in the usual way: positions gained, positions lost, numbers of units that remained operational, and those that did not, but these measurements did not fully explain what had taken place, because the surface-level result did not reflect the deeper mechanism that had produced it. And without understanding that mechanism, the event would appear as nothing more than a difficult engagement under challenging conditions, rather than what it actually was, which is a controlled outcome shaped before the first movement was made. In the aftermath, reports were gathered and analyzed through the standard processes that are designed to extract meaning from complex situations. Patterns were identified, timelines were reconstructed, and decisions were evaluated based on the information that had been available at the time. But as more data was reviewed, and as more accounts were compared, a consistency began to appear that could not be explained through coincidence or normal variance in combat conditions, because the alignment between the actions taken and the responses encountered was too precise to be accidental and too consistent to be ignored. This led to a shift in interpretation, where the focus moved away from the execution of the operation and toward the conditions that had existed prior to its initiation, because it became increasingly clear that the environment in which the operation had been conducted was not neutral, and that neutrality is a fundamental assumption in any plan. When that assumption is removed, the structure of the plan itself becomes unstable, regardless of how well it is executed. The realization that the opposing force had possessed a level of insight that allowed them to anticipate movements and prepare responses in advance reframed the entire sequence of events, because it meant that the challenges encountered during the operation were not unexpected obstacles, but expected outcomes within a framework that had been defined by that insight. And this distinction is critical, because it separates the concept of reacting to a situation from the concept of operating within a situation that has already been arranged. For the individuals who had participated in the operation, this understanding did not emerge all at once, and in many cases it remained incomplete, because the perspective required to see the full pattern exists above the level at which individual experiences occur, but the effects of that pattern were felt directly through the conditions they faced, the decisions they were forced to make, and the limitations that shaped those decisions. For the command structure, the implications were more immediate, because recognizing that the foundation of the operation had been compromised required a reassessment of the processes that had led to that point. It required an examination of how information had been handled, how assumptions had been formed, and how those assumptions had influenced the design of the plan. And while such reassessment can provide valuable insight, it cannot change the outcome that has already occurred. This is one of the defining characteristics of situations where information plays a decisive role. Once it has been exposed, and once it has been used to shape the environment, the effects cannot be undone in real time. They can only be understood after the fact and used to inform future actions, but the event itself remains fixed as the product of those earlier conditions. When viewed from a broader perspective, the significance of this operation extends beyond its immediate outcome, because it illustrates a principle that applies across contexts and across time that the effectiveness of any action is dependent not only on the quality of its execution, but on the accuracy and security of the information that supports it. And when that information is compromised, the resulting imbalance can determine outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible, but are ultimately decisive. This principle is often overshadowed by the more visible aspects of conflict, such as movement, force, and direct engagement. But in cases like this, it becomes clear that the underlying structure created by information can have a greater impact than any single action taken within that structure, because it defines the conditions under which all actions occur, and by doing so, it shapes the range of possible outcomes before those actions are even carried out. As the final assessments were completed, and as the event was integrated into the broader understanding of the conflict, the conclusion that emerged was not centered on failure in the conventional sense, but on the recognition that the parameters of the situation had been altered in a way that removed the possibility of achieving the intended objectives within the framework that had been established. And this recognition carries a different kind of weight because it shifts responsibility away from individual decisions made under pressure and toward the processes that determine how those situations are constructed in the first place. In the end, the most important moment of the operation was not the point at which the first resistance was encountered or the point at which the outcome became visible. It was the earlier moment when information changed hands, and with it, the balance of understanding changed as well. Because that moment set the conditions that would later be experienced as events on the ground, and once those conditions were in place, the path forward was no longer defined solely by the actions of those moving through it. This is why the outcome can be described not as a result that was produced during the operation, but as a result that was revealed through it, because the determining factors had already been established, and the events that followed served only to bring those factors into view. And this is the distinction that defines the story. Not a battle that was lost in the moment, but a battle that was lost in the preparation. A situation where the visible sequence of actions gives the impression of ongoing decision-making, while the underlying structure has already narrowed the possibilities to a single direction. When viewed in this way, the operation becomes more than a historical event. It becomes an example of how control can be exerted, not through direct confrontation, but through the management of information and the shaping of expectation, and how once that control is established, the outcome that follows is less a matter of chance and more a matter of inevitability. Because the final result did not depend on what happened when the soldiers moved forward. It depended on what had already happened before they ever began.